55 when I joined the band, I really wondered what I'd let myself in for, all these old blokes, and they'd all been in, so many of them have been in the band for 30 years, and there were only a few young ones, and they were there yesterday, both of them a year older than me, but we were the three young ones. Until Ewan Creed, he really did look after me on first baritone, and right through, he followed me all the way through. So, you know, there were some great experienced players in that band, mature age, but dear, they were, you know, almost, you know, men of the world. And here I was, this country kid, I'd never been to the big city, etc. So it was an eye-opener. And in fact, I used to wonder, have I done the right thing getting involved with all of this? Turned out, you know, I obviously did. So it's been great. I just wanted to be a good euphonium player with no real ambition. It was Charlie Scott that told me that he thought I had something and that I should be his deputy, and he'd do his level best to expose me to it. And I was determined that whatever I did it well. So, being made bandmaster, the band had been reduced, all the old boys had gone, and I started off with a band of 22. And I was just determined to play music well and not to show off. So I never went for the big stuff. It was always music that was confined to the abilities of the band. So my big number in my first year as bandmaster was Stedman Allen's Go Down Moses. And so I never really wanted to play the big stuff purely to show off, but I wanted to present music, quality music, well, and I wanted to encourage composers. Fortunately for me, when I became bandmaster, being the late 60s, that was the era when we had so many fine composers in the Salvation Army. We had the Dean Goffin and Eric Leidson from the past, and then the Condons and the Stedman Allens. I mean, Stedman Allen had been around for a while, but he became big time when he produced The Holy War in the mid-60s. Condon was another great salvo composer, there's no doubt about that. And I had him out soon after I got Stedman Allen out, and he played that Celestial Morn tuba solo as well. Brian Bowen struck me as being quality when he started writing. I mean, when the ISB came out in the 67, they played My Comfort and Strength. Now that's gorgeous, it really is, and that is music as far as I'm concerned. So I took a liking to Brian Bowen, and he produced you know, some jolly good music, but that Comfort and Strength was an outstanding number. Bearcroft came on the scene as well, and he did produce some good music. Ray Bowes was different. Now Ray Bowes produced some luscious sounds. I learned later that he was, his favourite composer was Vaughan Williams. I mean, if I'd have been asked who was my second or my third, then Vaughan Williams would have been there. Vaughan Williams, because of his lush sounds. I've been listening, and I've got lots of Sibelius up on my computer, and I've got a book there, and I list in the book, because I've got everything that the Berlin Phil, so I'm a bit restricted with that. I've stopped subscribing to other live streaming. I was getting too costly, but I stuck with the Berlin Phil. But I've got a book there, and I've got all the Mahler versions of every symphony, and then the Sibelius, but I got Rimsky-Korsakov, who I like, different. The difficulty with Ray Bowes is a simple little Sunday morning devotional thing doesn't take a 5-minute run through, but you've got to spend more time on it because the sounds are different, but they're lush. So I go for Vaughan Williams. When the Holy War came out, I wasn't the bandmaster, it was Charlie Scott's time. I was the deputy bandmaster, and I bought that record with Christ as the Answer and the Holy War, and the ISB were a great band at that time. They had the sound, the warmth, and they were more interested in heart than in technique. And that's what I was. I wasn't overly concerned about technique. My dad, when I was growing up as a kid, would not let me practice the fast stuff. If he heard me playing triple tonguing, he would roar tribe out of me. He said, "No, you've got to concentrate on your sound and on hymn tune melody playing," which I did, and I used to insist on that with the Staff Band. But we heard the Holy War, and Charlie Scott loved it, and Charlie Scott played it, of course, at a congress the year that it came out, and I don't know whether we did it justice, but at least we presented it, and we had a great screed explaining what the Holy War was, but I was just the deputy on Euphonium. But it hit the brass band world, and it was just different. And of course, even Christ as the Answer was an eye opener as well. I didn't play the Holy War a lot in my time. As man, I mean, I played it, but I was at the Holy War that I was rehearsing, and I was wanting more bass trombone, and he said, "Excuse me, bandmaster, I can't give you any more. I'm seeing stars as it is." But I did use it, of course, but I was trying to keep up with, at that time, Stedman Allen was writing all we started with Holy War, but he was writing all this great long numbers, of course, but great music, and I just loved his music. But you know, there must be half a dozen of those that I used to play that haven't seen the light of day. They've not been published in that Beautiful Land, whatever it was, is one of them. There's so many of them. I don't know where the music is now. The Holy War is the start of a whole series of great numbers, all stemming from Ray Stedman Allen. I didn't know a lot about Wolf Eaton. His music was much more difficult to play as it progressed, but his music didn't get to see the light of day in London. It sat in their coffers for years, but I loved his music. It was Wolf Eaton that I wanted to meet, didn't get to, but I saw him in the audience in England somewhere, and I had opened the program with one of his little hymn tune arrangements. So I always like to open programs with something warm to help them acclimatise to the building before we got stuck into a march in the program itself. So I never got to know Wolf, but I learned a lot about Wolf Eaton because I was very friendly with Ken Smith. Now, Ken Smith was the famous trumpet player who became a salvo for a short period, unfortunately, because it wasn't good for him, I don't think. And he was the bandmaster of Box Hill. And I got to know him very well, and we produced a recording of him playing with the Staff Band 4 solos, and one of them was Nearer to Thee. So I got to know Ken Smith, and in retirement, he lived in over Rosanna Way somewhere, and I used to meet up with him every week, and I would spend hours talking music, mainly non-band music actually, but talk music and banding, and I got to know in Ken Smith, and Ken Smith had been his best man at his wedding. When Ken Smith had moved from New Zealand to England to play in one of the big contesting bands, Ferry Aviation. I don't know whether it was Ferry Aviation, but one of them. So I got to know a lot about Wolf Heaton and the man growing up in the music shop and all the rest of it. And I just wished that I'd have been able to meet him. I loved James Curnow, and we had James Curnow out here. And James Curnow and his son followed the band around on the American tour, because I played a bit of his music in those days. So the Army had some great composers. But Morley Calvert, I remember having played his For Our Transgressions, but I also loved his Canadian folk song suite, and that was different. That introduced clapping, that's proved to be popular in the contesting band world as well. Dean Goffin, who we haven't mentioned much of, but he knew how to write delightful, warm music, and I used to love what he wrote. In the late 70s, there was a clutch of Americans, apart from Lydson, who'd been around for years, that were coming on the scene, and James Curnow was one that appealed to me because I loved the sort of sounds that he created. Bill Himes, because his music became quite popular and playable, and yes, he's the one that introduced new things. Morley Calvert was great, but he didn't produce anywhere near enough. Bill Himes continued and churned out a lot of music, some of it great. James Curnow continues to write, but it's all quality. Morley Calvert, now the selection that appealed to me for him was For Our Transgressions, and I remember when the band were in Canada, Montreal, and I didn't know at the time that he was going to be there, but he turned up, and I happened to have scheduled it for the morning devotional number, and I caught up with him. He disappeared straight after the meeting, and I chased him up the street because I'd never met him, and he was in tears, the poor bloke. So he was another one who was humble. In 1964, Charlie Scott was made bandmaster, and he, within a couple of months, asked me whether I'd be his deputy. I knew him well because he worked in the bank as well, and I grew to admire him because of his genuineness and his humbleness, etc. He was the one who developed me. I have since learned after Charlie Scott, when I became bandmaster, I've since learned that Charlie Scott took the band on reluctantly, but on the proviso that he would find the next bandmaster. And he said, I might need 5 years to do that, so I'm prepared to take the band on for 5 years and I'll find a replacement. And in the first couple of months he looked at Brian Davies, John Edwards and me. We were 3 young, keen, one was solo horn, solo cornet, solo effort, but we were all keen, and he knew that, and he took us in. We didn't know that the other 2 were being looked at, and he then took us to the band room with a recording, and he'd given us a score to study, and then asked us to conduct it to a recording. He made me deputy, and I said, and I agreed, and I thought to myself, well, gee, you know, I know nothing much about harmony. How am I going to read a score and assess how it should be played, etc.? So I started harmony lessons. And John Butler in the band was playing tuba in the RAF and recommended the principal clarinet player to me, who had quite a few qualifications in music, and I started harmony lessons with him. But I'd only done 2, I suppose, lessons when he chatted away to me and he said, why do you want to learn harmony? And I said, well, I've just been made Deputy Bandmaster of the Salvation Army, and I thought I needed to know a little bit about harmony. I still don't know anything about harmony, by the way, but I said I need to know a little bit about this. He said, well, what do you know about conducting? And I said, nothing. And he said, well, how can you be deputy and not study conducting? He said, look, I'll switch from harmony and I'll teach you conducting. He said, I did a 12-month course at the Melbourne Uni, or Con, whatever it was, I don't know where, under George Sapine. Now, George Sapine was a Frenchman, principal conductor of the Melbourne Symphony. And I knew him because I used to go, didn't know him, but I knew of him because I used to subscribe to the Melbourne Symphony concerts. That was one of the first things I did when I came to Melbourne, was start subscribing to the Melbourne Symphony orchestral concerts, and stayed as a subscriber right through till about 4 years ago, when I couldn't do the steps at the Hamer Hall. So I knew George Sapine and how he conducted, and this chap, Brooks, I can't think of his Christian name, had studied conducting under George Sapine. So I said, I jumped at it, and I didn't have any more harmony lessons, so I still don't know anything about harmony. I know how to look for consecutive fifths. So the best thing he did in conducting was introduce a little book to me called Conducting Without Fears. I forget the writer, but he produced 2 books. One was Conducting Without Tears, and the other one was Conducting Without Fears, and they were both quite small. They're still available, and this was ideal. The writer was not an orchestral conductor; he was a choral conductor, and it had all the standard, patterns of conducting. But what it was full of was exercises on conducting from the fingers and the wrist. And so I used to do this religiously, practice all the exercises. You had to hold your baton and hold your arm still and twist your arm and go in different directions. A host of exercises and the 180 degree or 360 degree, whatever. It used to hurt my wrist, but I practiced them, and I practiced them in front of the mirror to make sure that my arm wasn't moving, and the baton was. And of course it had exercises on producing a click, the flick, in the band, because otherwise they don't know which part of the beat to come in on. And in some bands you'll find that it's at the end of the beat rather than the beginning. And I always insisted that they played precisely on the flick of the beat. So you'll notice that my conducting is small from the wrist, but also it has an indication as to the start of the note, and I always insisted that they play on that flick of the note. So this chap Brooks was a godsend to me. It only lasted a month or so, and he was taken away. I think the RAF band went overseas, and then he took on to some other job. So I didn't have any more lessons, but it was sufficient for me to. Prior to me starting those conducting lessons, Charlie Scott, as the deputy, Charlie Scott at a congress, I'd just been made deputy bandmaster, and a congress came along. This was in the exhibition building in Melbourne, and in the morning meeting, a week beforehand, he gave me the score of a piece for the morning meeting to conduct. So I did, because it was part of my training. I was scared stiff, I was wetting my pants, but I did it. And in the audience was a chap called Ted Murdoch, and he had been in the band in my early years, and he worked in the bank. He'd retired from the band, and he worked in the bank, and I met him on the Monday after the Congress. He said, "What on earth were you doing yesterday, conducting the band like that?" See, and he said, "You were all down here." He said, "Your baton was below your navel." He said, "They've got to be able to see it. Hold it up." And that was, I mean, to some they might have been hurt, sent home in tears, but it was good news for me, and that was a good lesson to learn. And this little green book says, between the navel and the news and the nose is where your beat should be, so it's just in front there. The good thing from experience is that it forces them to look at it. So Ted Murdoch, an old staff bandy, gave me good advice, even though to some they would have been hurt and despondent, gave it away. So I took it seriously, but I took everything seriously. I wanted to do it didn't matter whether it was at work or wherever, I had to do it properly or not at all. So that's how I got into conducting. When I was made bandmaster, one of the things I did, apart from learning harmony and conducting, etc., was, that was when I was deputy, learning harmony and conducting. But when I became bandmaster, I wanted to observe how other good bandmasters ran their rehearsal. And so I went to the three top contesting bands, Hawthorn with old Bill Philpott, and Preston. And Preston had a conductor called Charlie Smith. And I learned a lot from him, and so I stopped going to the other two, and I went to several rehearsals under Charlie Smith. And Charlie Smith rarely used a baton, and everything was here. And that was good training for me. He had a magnificent band, he really did. They used to be A-grade champions. And he used to conduct with his fingers, generally, and right in front. He also, and one of the rehearsals that I went to, he was rehearsing the band as a male choir. They didn't sing out at all. And in talking to him, he said it's essential for them to have that training, because it's unaccompanied, for ear training. And he used to do it purely to ensure that they were getting. He had perfect pitch, of course. He was a good musician. I certainly didn't have perfect pitch. So he could tell you, what you should have, how untuneful you are and all the rest of it. But I used to love he ended up living near me, and he didn't know me at this time because I wasn't a bandmaster, and he was walking past and listened to me play my euphonium, practice my euphonium on a Saturday morning, and he heard me playing the euphonium solo in Uruguay Dis by Lalo. And I don't know whether you've heard that test piece. It's got a magnificent euphonium playing one of the tenor arias, and he heard me playing it, and he pricked his ears and came and knocked on my front door and wanted to know who it was, you see. So that was when I first met him, and that was before I went to his rehearsals. But I knew him because I used to follow the band contests. So when I went to his rehearsals, would be playing either some selection out of a Salvo book. He had one of the red army books, and he would be running through Road to Emmaus or whatever it was. But he would also run and do a bit of male voice singing unaccompanied to force them with their ear. So, you know, they're all good listens. So I learnt a lot from Charlie in rehearsal, how to go about rehearsal. But he also was a help with conducting because he managed to get a great band with doing nothing much. Brass banding in England started purely to occupy the coal miners because all they had to do was go home to the pub, and there were pubs on every corner of every little town, and that's all they did outside of working. And so they formed the brass banding, and it kept them together. And it's the same with the army. It held the men. Later on, as later 90s and onwards, the officers that are coming through the army haven't got the banding background, and they're not terribly interested. In fact, some of them make it obvious that they just don't like it. And, you know, some bands don't help either because they play so loud. And it's going well in Africa and Asia, the Salvos, but they've still got bands and timbrels and flags and marching and drums, the old army, that doesn't exist here. Well, we had to stop open airs, councils wouldn't let us and all that sort of stuff. But it was the neglect of the bands, as far as I'm concerned. And all right, you know, some of the arguments were bandsmen being band saved, and for me, so what? When I listen to the top contesting bands, because they're test pieces, they're stretching the range of players, and they're stretching the number of notes that they can play in a second. There doesn't appear a lot of nice music in it that I like. The days of Eric Ball, of course, it was different. Peter Graham on occasions produces some lovely big tunes, but generally the test pieces are all notes for me. Current day batch of music, without Kenneth Downey we'd be lost. With Stedman Allen, you could look at anything that he wrote. Some of it was difficult, but some delightful little, what we'd call Triumph series numbers, written for the smaller band. Magnificent music, because it's music. I wouldn't want to be a bandmaster these days. I was extremely fortunate to have grown up in the Salvos and banding in the Salvos during the 60s and the 70s. All right, I joined in the 50s, and that was a good decade of banding. In fact, I remember the Olympic Games in 56. Norm MacLeod was the bandmaster, and whoever was responsible for music in the territory organised a band fest in Melbourne as part of the Army celebration of the Olympics. And we had Perth Fortress, Adelaide Congress Hall, I think it might have been Unley, Sydney Congress Hall, Brisbane Temple. We had 6 or 7 bands, the peak bands of Australia, all gather in Melbourne to do a series of, each band did their own concerts scattered around the suburbs, and then we all got together in the Richmond Cricket Ground for the big band fest. And they were all good bands. But the bandmaster for all of them was someone who had been in the job for many years. Like Norm MacLeod, they were experienced and they had a strong support group of bandsmen who'd been with them and grown up with the bandmaster, and they were held together because of that. Then the late 60s, changes started taking place, and the young breed came in, and it was me and the Staff Band, it was Brian Davies in Camberwell, it was Don McCoy in Moreland. Quite a few of the bands changed over their bandmaster round about the same time. And so there was a change in style of banding for the good, for me. They dispensed with the hard attacking of notes and the solid playing, and became warmer in their approach and nicer in their method of tonguing. I was taught as a kid, and the tutors that were published, they produced a note as though you were spitting the hair off the tip of your tongue. And that's exactly how they played. And it was stabbing, you see. So you can blame the tutors for it. But that started changing. We started getting a little bit close to orchestral playing. And I felt that in the late 60s and the 70s, the music changed, the approach to playing it changed, and the bands had a greater appeal, to me anyway, a greater appeal in how they approached their playing. Then the 80s came, and of course the Joy Strings had been introduced in London. That was in the 60s, I think. And then people started taking to the string, the guitars and whatnot. The solid rock in the 70s, and I started pricking my ears, and I thought, well, this is great. You know, we could do with something other than old-fashioned brass bands, and I was all for it. But I think the officer ranks started poo-pooing brass bands, and were all for these guitars, and then that changed the style of song and chorus singing in the meetings, and they were neglecting, these are the officers, they were neglecting the brass band. They weren't terribly interested in holding them like the old days. See, I've always preached that it was the brass band that held the army together, because they produced the kids who became officers and whatnot. But, you know, in the 70s, 80s, the officers hadn't grown up through the band, and they weren't interested in the band. It was old-fashioned to them, and it was the old cloth cap miner image that they had, and they were being neglected. I blame the bandmasters for not doing something about it. That's why I used to put on as many big festivals and bring as many composers out as I possibly could. I also wanted, when I became bandmaster, to reduce the calendar, and it was far too heavy, reduce the calendar so as core bands could function better, knowing that they had all their bandsmen. I eventually brought in 10 a year, but I wanted to do it because I wanted to make sure that the core bands weren't failing, and I also wanted to make sure that staff bandsmen were able to be made bandmasters, songster leaders or whatever, whereas they weren't out. They weren't able to because they were never there. They were out with the staff band. So I remember in the 70s when these rules had all changed, and I had to do it through, the Chief Secretary at headquarters, changing the rules, etc. I had a 6-band festival where all the bandmasters were staff bandsmen. Graham Farragher had McLeod. He eventually became an officer and came into the staff band on trombone. Brian Davies, of course, had Camberwell. Rob Beasy had Box Hill. So staff bandsmen were then running these bands, and it was great. We were in the Robert Blackwood, and these 6 bands were all, the stage was chock-a-block of 6 individual bands, and it was a great night. I wanted to do that sort of stuff because I was scared that banding would fall away. And it did. It started happening in the late 80s, and I wrote about it. And in the Musician, it might have been early 90s when I wrote it, and it got a huge reaction from the readers. Many of them, of course, all agreeing, but some disagreeing with what I had said, because I said, if you're not careful, the demise of the brass band will be the demise of the Salvation Army. It's coming true, as it turns out. It's what's happening. But I was taken up with that, and that was the main issue that they were against. For as far back as I can remember, I was mad keen on music. Not bands, music, and in particular orchestras. And I used to listen to the ABC on our tiny little radio, and to the orchestras, and then on a weekly basis the band parade that we used to put on a Saturday afternoon. So I grew to love the cello, and in particular the cello, and the French horn. But my father, trying to coach me to be a good euphonium player, said, you must listen to the cello in the orchestra and the bassoon in the symphonic wind ensembles, and listen to how they approach their part, because that's what the euphonium has to do in the brass band. So that forced me to listen closely to the cello. When I was 15, left school early to work because my parents were poor and I was number 8 in the family, and they were anxious to get as much board paid as was possible. I joined the council. When I left school, my first pay packet was straight through to the music shop. There's only one in the town, and I bought a LP of Pablo Casals and Bach's cellos, which I don't know which one it was. I think number 6, but it doesn't matter. And that was my first recording I ever bought. And then when I came to Melbourne in '55, and I joined up the World Record Club, and the first thing I bought was Dennis Brain playing Mozart's 4-horn concertos. And because I used to delight listening to Dennis Brain on the French horn. So that was my music background. As a 6-7-year-old, I was never interested in sport. I didn't go out playing much with the kids in the street, and that's where they all were, out in the street. I'd be sitting on the veranda playing a mouth organ or a record or whatever that I could afford, or Mum could afford, just to learn music. But of had me join in the band and on trombone, and I was a small kid, embarrassing. The trombone was as big as me. I went to they used to have these band contests, what were they called? Talent quests in the solos every year, and I entered, and I had to play on the trombone London Derriere, and that starts off with a D, which is the sixth position, and I couldn't reach it, so that was a useless sort of a note to start with, and I didn't get anywhere, of course, in the talent quest. But over the years, the adjudicator was usually a George Dickens. Now, I never ever got to really know him, but he had been the staff bandmaster before Norm MacLeod, back in the 20s and the 30s. And I think he may have whispered to Norm MacLeod when I had applied that you won't need to do an audition with him, you can let him go straight into the band, because I didn't have any audition for the staff band. So my music, at 15, I bought that recording of Pablo Casals, but I also started piano lessons. And I always wanted to learn the piano, and Mum and Dad couldn't afford it. So I started paying for my music lessons. She was the teacher was the church organist at the Congregational Church, but her profession was teaching piano. But we didn't have a piano, we had an organ, one of those pedal organs, and Mum and Dad both played it. And we used to sit around that every night singing hymns or whatever. And this girl taught me the piano, and after a few months she said, look, it's no good you only having an organ to play on. It came in handy for the keyboard, etc., but if you're going to learn the piano properly. So I bought myself a piano, a Wertheim, second hand. It weighed a ton, and it wasn't, a great instrument by the time I got hold of it. And my aim was to get myself a lovely, proper piano. I bought this English make Belling piano, brand new, beautiful. I loved it. But 6 months later, the floods came to Maitland. That was in '55, when I was 52. The floods came, and the piano was ruined because, we lost everything. Dad didn't want me to come to Melbourne because I was his euphonium player. Dad was a horn player, came out from England because of the strikes in the coal mining, and he was developing a family, had 4 kids, and thought he needed to go somewhere. He was out of work. The coal mines were on strike, and the salvos here in Melbourne, in conjunction with the government, hired passenger boats and filled them up with salvos and with orphans. And the salvos' job, they came out free. The salvos' job was to look after the orphans on the boat until they were handed over to the government to go into government institutes. So my dad was mad keen bandy, and he grew up in north of England where all the good bands were. So he knew Eric Ball and he knew a lot of these people. So I learnt a lot from him, but he used to sing his testimony of a Sunday morning, and I used to get to be. Dad was an identity in growing up in Maitland. Everybody knew him, and he used to stand on the post office steps of a Sunday morning, and people would just come up and chat away to him. So I got a lot of what I've got musically and every other way. I'm an image of Dad, except I don't sing my testimony. When I got into the staff band, I was content to play second baritone. Within 6 months, I was on UFO with Johnny Butler. Fortunately, because my cousin who had been on UFO had been transferred to Sydney, I wanted to always do things correctly and as professionally as possible, whether it was work or or what. Because music was my life, I wasn't interested in sport or anything else, or girls for that matter. It was music, and I just for somehow loved music. I've spent my life always emphasising quality over quantity in absolute everything.